The Mid-America Veterans Museum is a 501c3 nonprofit business. The museum would not exist without the donations of our generous community. Your donations ensure the museum continues to share and preserve the stories of our veterans. Would you like to be part of something special? To donate, visit mavm.org and click on Donate. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only. The primary purpose of the Operation Insight podcast is to educate. The views, information, or opinions expressed on the Operation Insight podcast are solely the views of the individuals or guests involved and by no means represent absolute facts. Operation Insight does not accept responsibility for their views or comments. The Operation Insight podcast may at times cover sensitive topics, including but not limited to suicide, abuse, violence, severe mental illness, sex, drugs, and alcohol addiction. You are advised to refrain from watching or listening to the Operation Insight podcast if you are likely to be offended or adversely impacted by any of these topics. Neither the company, host, director, or the guest shall at any time be liable for the content covered, causing offense, distress, or any other reaction. Welcome to Operation Insight Podcast from the Mid-America Veterans Museum with your host, Jason Galvin, and Sergeant Ethan Gross. Today in studio, we have Captain William Reynolds. Captain William Reynolds goes by Bill, so we'll refer to him as Bill in the show. And he served in the United States Air Force from 1963 to 1969, both active duty and reserves. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you, and we always start with this question here. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up.
Well, I was born in Murfreesboro, Illinois. That's where my mother came from. I grew up in Dupo, or slightly north of Dupo, and went to grade school, high school. Went down to college at Carbondale at SIU for about 4 years and graduated from there and picked up my second lieutenant commission at that time. And so after I went for 6 months at McDonnell Aircraft, before I went in on active duty, I was able to work on the F-4 project and then went into service, then came back out of the service and went back to McDonnell Aircraft again. I couldn't stay there. I was not an engineer, and they wanted me to do that kind of work, and I was doing the work, but it was too much pressure. And so I then went to teaching school and did that till 95 and retired in 95, went back to work again for another 14, and here I am today, retired.
I'm going to jump in here for a second, Jason. I'm going to have to watch myself and not call you Mr. Reynolds because that's how I know you. I'm going to be a little bit biased during this interview. I've known Bill for my entire life. My family's known him for a long, long time. Mr. Reynolds is kind of a local legend over in southern Illinois, especially Dupo in that area. So it's a great, immense pleasure for me to be able to sit here and speak with you and hear your story. I've been fortunate to hear it once already, and then obviously you have shared your two books with me, both the inspirational stories as well as the Tiger 24 book, which I'm very grateful to have those both. Something I'd love for you to tell us about, Bill, is your dad and your brother served. Isn't that correct?
Yes, absolutely. My dad has a good story which would work right in if he lived in this area. He was an uncontrollable teenager. I've heard from friends, okay? My grandfather was an engineer on the railroad, top dollar person. My father had his own horse. I have a picture of him when he was young. He was a good-looking guy with lots of hair and just uncontrollable. You may have heard somebody say to their child who was uncontrollable, if you're not going to behave, I'm going to send you to military school. That's what my grandfather did. He sent him to military school because they couldn't control him in Dupo or Columbia. And so he went to military school, and then all of a sudden 1917 came along, and he decided to go into the service. Well, since he had his own horse and he knew all about the military, he went into the military as a buck nobody, and before he got out of training, he was the top sergeant in the group.
Oh, wow.
Because he knew about military, he knew about horses, and that's all it was. He went to overseas. Long about 1918, they were getting ready to move for the final push, and he was in an artillery unit, knew all about horses. Just about the time they got orders to move, the Germans decided to shell, and a shell went off. Oh, the horse bucked up when it started shelling.
Sure.
He knew what to do. He jumped on the lead horse, just as the shell came and exploded right under the horse. Of course, it killed the horse, saved my father. His legs were hanging down. They were shredded. He was in the hospital. They didn't even send him home. They didn't think he was going to live, so they didn't send him home. He was in a French hospital. The surgeons were excellent. He had silver ankle bones. Now, he walked just like anybody else. He couldn't run, but his ankles were made of silver. And, of course, I can remember as a kid, every so often, he'd say, "Mom, get the tweezers." A piece of shrapnel would come to the surface, and she would have to take it out. So,
wow.
Well, that's a very interesting story there.
Yeah.
And now there's a story about your great-grandfather sending a letter to a general.
I have the letter. He didn't come home. Everybody else came home, and he was not there. And so finally, my grandfather, they couldn't do things in those days. They had to write letters and things. And I have the letter from my grandfather that asked, "What's happened to my son?" And the general, of course, sent back a letter, "Sir, I'm sorry this has happened. I will look into it personally, and you will get notice real quick." Well, I don't have the letter that came back then. But he did call him and say, "He's okay, he's alive, and we're going to send him back as soon as he's capable of coming back." I have no idea what happened to him in the 1920s. He never would tell us. My mother didn't know. And so as a result, I have no idea what happened to him in the 20s. But then he finally survived. He had various jobs. Finally, World War II came along. He went to work for the Reserve Pacific Railroad and retired as a crew clerk from that point on. Never did tell us very much about his life.
And now, one more thing, and then we'll get to your career here,
That's
Bill.
all right.
But your younger brother was a Marine.
My younger brother was a Marine. He was always a little bit tougher than I was, And he went in the Marines. I went in the Air Force. And the story that I remember about him, I'm glad he didn't get hurt, but when I was in primary, we had a person come in who was very good at hand-to-hand, and he taught us how to kill somebody if you're within an arm's length.
That comes in useful.
And now I always thought at the time, I just hope I never react that way. One day we were home on leave the same time. And, of course, he had to show his Marine Corps prowess.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
He came up from behind me and put his arm around me and clinched me, and he said, "Okay, let's just see how tough you are." I don't remember what he had to tell me what he said. As soon as his arms went around him, my hand went down between his legs this way. My elbow went around and cuffed him in the side of the face, and he fell down. And he didn't get up for a while. And I was so happy that he did have 3 children. Okay.
It was questionable for a minute there, wasn't it?
And I didn't remember that. I didn't remember. And all my life, when a kid would challenge me sometime, I just would try to walk away because I didn't know what would happen. We just were so prone to do these things without thinking.
Right.
And it was tough. And it was, we used to sit around and toughen our hands up.
Yes, I do
Fingers.
know. Yep.
You understand that?
Yeah. I used to have a guy an old guy that had the tip of his finger cut off from a machine, and he made that stub the strongest thing that was part of his body. He would poke you with it if you got out of line, and you knew the thump was coming.
So I've never had another incident where I had to warn a kid one time, and this and that, but I never had a chance.
You almost went into Terminator mode or something.
Yeah, you go into Terminator mode for sure.
I guess.
Well, Ethan, I'm going to let you lead this conversation today since you know Bill so well,
Yeah.
and then I'll chime in when I have something to offer, but I'll let you lead this.
Most definitely.
Hey, good. I'm happy to have you. Lead this.
Well, Bill, I'd love to hear about how you first got into the service.
Okay. Well, I was a young boy in World War II. We lived on every word that came from the front. The only thing we could get were newsreels that we had to go to the show to see. I was in thrall with airplanes my whole life. When I was in the 4th grade or 5th grade, we even had a challenge in my class, and we divided into 2 parts. Which was the best airplane, the P-38 or the P-47? And we challenged and went all this, and then all of a sudden the scouts took us over to Scott Field, and a new airplane came in called the P-51 Mustang. We changed our minds and decided that was the best airplane. I also saw the first jet to come to Scott. It was a P-80, and I couldn't get over the fact that the airplane, I saw it coming, but I didn't hear it. And then finally it flashed overhead, and we heard the sound. And, of course, the P-80 was the forerunner of the T-33. The T-33 just happened to be a better airplane. Why? I don't know whether they knew why. But they stretched the fuselage a little bit, put a second person in. It was a trainer, and it was a whole lot better than the F-80.
That's the Shooting Star or T-Bird?
Shooting Star, yeah. They did something to it. I don't know what they did to it, but we could do things in that airplane that I couldn't do in an F-86. Okay, and the one thing that we did was the fact that Lockheed sent a tech rep in to tell us all about the T-33, and he made a mistake. In his conversation, he said, now, you can read in your book where the T-33 is stressed to 7.5 Gs. But he said, we did it better than that. We made the airplane so it'll stress over 9.5 Gs.
Oh, man.
So you understand what went through all our minds at
Yes.
the time. Okay, we had seen 7.5 Gs because that was part of the training. And so my job was to see if I could get to 9.5. And one day I was soloing, and everything worked just right. I did a rolling pullout, as they called it, and as a result, the old needle went up to 9.5 and stuck there. Okay, boy, I was happy. Came down, landed. I stayed in the cockpit, and I waved to the people to come out and look at the gauge. It said 9.5. And these guys were getting up and one at a time looking at the gauge, and the line chief saw what was going on. Okay, and so he come running out to that airplane, and I waited to the last minute to punch it off. And as he jumped up on the side, I punched it off to 0. So only those people that saw that in the 15 minutes that I was a hero.
Absolutely.
That was all.
Well, I want to get to the bottom of something here, Bill. Your Army physical. There's something discrepancy there.
As you know, when we turned 18 in the 1950s, when you turned 18, you had to go take an induction physical from the Army or whatever was there, and I got to be 18, and I went over and took a physical, and I thought I was pretty great. And we were all sitting out in the lobby and all of a sudden I got called into the doctor's office. And I thought, wow, what's this all about? And I walked in, sat down, he said, son, I've got good or bad news. He said, you failed the physical. When I was a child, I had something called rheumatic fever. It did not settle in my heart. It settled in my legs. My legs would swell up, and I missed school 1 month each my 7th and 8th grade years. And so I didn't know that would kick me out. And I said, sir, I'm sorry in ROTC, and I'm sorry to like to fly. And he said, fine, sir, here's how you do it. This physical does not go forward. He said, it goes in my drawer, and it never goes anyplace else. You just can't tell them this, 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 and this. And so I didn't. I didn't tell them that. The only problem that I would have had, if I would have had to bail out, my landing probably would have been suspect.
Yeah. He gave you the answers to the test, basically.
Yeah. But I didn't have to do that. And you'll hear some stories later where I should have, but didn't bail out.
Well, another thing I want to get into is you have, some of this is from your book, you have these moments, basically your 15 minutes of fame, but on multiple occasions. Let's go through some of those stories.
Oh, sure. That I was so fortunate. I was so happy as a young person from Dupo who had never flown in an airplane before. I had never been in an airplane. I'd been around them. And boy, when I got to summer camp and they took me in an airplane, I was just high on the hog, you know. My first flight was in a T-33. If I ever met that instructor again, I think I'd have punched him out. He didn't take in fact that it was my first flight. He made me sick. I had to buy a new hat, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And he did not, he was not very interested in making me like the Air Force. He probably tried to make me hate it. So I was sick for a weekend after being air sick. The second time I went was in a B-25. I didn't have any problems. I did feel sick a little bit, but you can't get sick in a B-25. And so I had a great instructor going into primary. He knew, I told him right about it at the beginning, and we had something brand new in the 1950s called a plastic bag. We'd never seen those things before. And so I always carried a plastic bag in my pocket. And if I got up and got sick, I'd fill the plastic bag, tie it off. As we came down and landed, he made sure that we pulled over next to the weeds, and I'd flip the bag out into the weeds, not tell anybody. Now, can you imagine, can anybody guess why or when I quit getting sick?
I'm guessing when you were the only person in the plane.
That's exactly the right way.
Would have much choice at that point.
When I soloed, I never got sick again.
Very interesting.
Because
you think it was more mental or was it physical?
It's all mental. Mm-hmm. I'm sure it is. Now, the only other time I got sick was flying a C-119 at low level on a tactical mission. We'd always decide that we'd fly 10 minutes apiece. The pilot would fly 10, the co-pilot would fly 10. By the end of this mission, we were both flying the airplane because we were both sick. And if you both flew it, at least you thought you weren't going to get sick, but we mostly did. But it wasn't the kind of sickness we couldn't control, thank heavens.
And what kind of locations were you at primarily during your service?
Well, first of all, they still had World War II training programs. I went to a place called Spence in Moultrie, Georgia. It was a civilian contract school where all my instructors were civilians and excellent instructors. Now, we did have military on the base because they are the ones that gave the check rides.
Is that because the Air Force was first the Army Air, and before the Air Force had its own designation?
The Army Air Force, and the fact of the matter is they could not have their own training schools in World War II. They didn't have enough people.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so as a result, they passed it over to the civilians, and they were just excellent instructors. My instructor, his nickname was the Axe. And if you want to know about that, he was the instructor that if somebody became suspect, he would give them a flight to see whether or not they would kick them out of the Air Force or keep them in.
Yeah.
And he just found something, I think it was all mental. This is the way he talked to me. Because I remember one time I was doing pretty good, okay? And I think my head was enlarging slightly, even at that age. So he took me up one day, and we just did all sorts of maneuvers and aerobatics. And all of a sudden, after about 30 minutes of this, he said, "Now, take us home." I had no idea where we were in southern Georgia. I had no idea. And he said, well, he quit hollering at me. He just quit. He said, "Take me home." He said, "I'm not going to help you. You either get us home or we're going to land out here someplace." So I knew the procedure. What we did was We flew down next to a town. We went by the water tower. We found out that the name of the town was Pelham. Okay, and then I knew exactly where I was.
That's awesome. I love that story.
And he quit screaming at me as soon as we did that. He just very quiet, and I was scared to death because he was screaming and hollering at me. And we got back, got out of the airplane, started walking to the shack, and he said, "Good job." That's all.
So you didn't get the axe?
No, I didn't.
Hence the nickname.
And somehow or another, he must have felt something or saw something in me, because my first check ride was pretty high, and he didn't say a word. He just smiled. And then I took my instrument check ride, and I got a real high score on that, and he just smiled. And so as a result, one of my final check rides was with the military, and I just had a good time. I just had a good time with the check rides.
This kind of sets the stage, Jason, just so you know. Mr. Reynolds has this extremely interesting and illustrious career in the service, but it's also a career that was marked by a lot of, I don't know what the word for it is, but you were kind of a rascal at times. Is that fair to say?
I would say so. I think that, when my first airplane was a T-34, we had 40 hours in it. I passed my check ride at about 35, and everybody was happy. I still had to get those other 5 hours, so another boy and I, after the instructor left, we said, okay, let's go to the south field and we'll play chase. All right, so we took off a little bit, about maybe 2 minutes apart, took off, bet down at the south field or the south area, and we just played chase and pulled G-forces. I pulled so many G-forces that I was blacked out part of the time.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and I tried to just, I tried to do that, but I wasn't good enough to understand G-forces. And so I'd pull G-forces, black out, and then I'd come to, and it was my turn to lead, and I went into one of those fantastic turns, and I never did see my wingman again. I have no idea what happened to him. He said he doesn't remember because he was pulling G's like I was, and when we came out, I think we were in opposite directions.
Love it. That's a great story.
Yeah, you call that a game of chase. Some people call that a game of life or death.
Yeah, exactly. Good thing you didn't black out too long.
Well, after that, I learned about blacking out. Another thing about blacking out, we found out that we did a lot of research about things when we went into jets, the T-33, and we found out that the guy in the back seat would black out before the guy in the front seat because he was more over the center of gravity, and the guy in the front seat wasn't, And so as a result, when I took my aerobatic check ride, I tried to keep the guy in the back seat blacked out. I would wait till my vision started to close down for blackout, and I'd keep it there. And then I knew he was blacked out in the back.
That's crazy.
And so as a result, I got a much better grade than I deserved.
Hey, yeah, you gotta give yourself whatever advantage you can, right?
Because after every maneuver, I'd pull out right on airspeed, direction, level. And he thought, well, that's pretty good.
That's really good. He just didn't know what he was looking at.
Yeah, we did a lot of time. When I went into one other story, I think I maybe put that in the book, but another story, I went to Valdosta for fighter training. And as a result, some mines, we didn't have a mission to do. The target couldn't come or something. And so one day, the weather was bad. We had high-level clouds and low-level clouds. And so they said, hey, you guys just go to the west area. Now, that didn't mean anything to you, but for me, when I heard west area, I knew exactly what we were going to do. So we set up our own channel, and I said, here's what we're going to do. In weather like this, the guys over at Spence come over and fly up and down our dividing line between the two bases. And they just fly at the edge because they think it's safer. Because if they're out in the middle, and then we had some accidents out in the middle. And so they'd fly up and down that line. So I said, here's what we'll do. We'll get to the line. We'll go to the southern part of the line, and we'll fly north, and I'll lead, and you can wingman, and I'll get them on radar. So the first time I went down, sure enough, my radar blinked a a great big blip on the radar, and I knew it was a T-28 with this propeller going around and around. And so we went by him real quick, and he didn't see us. Okay, that's okay. So I went up to the north area and said, now we'll go down and we'll head down south and pick up the guys coming north. And this time the instructor saw us. And so he went on something called Guard Channel, which everybody could listen, and he began to scream about these two F-86s that just made a firing pass on him, and he just screamed and hollered, and, of course, we very quickly turned and went east to stay away so nobody would catch us.
Yeah, those are great stories. I like the fact that you did whatever you thought was fun, you know. You got to have fun while you're in those aircrafts.
Yeah, I guess the last story like that, in Morocco flying F-86s, we went back. Now, when I was in Westover, we flew the F-86L. Now, the L was a modern version of the D. It had all sorts of fancy things. It had an antenna that if I pushed the button, a guy on the ground could fly the airplane for me.
Oh, that's interesting.
Now, that's way ahead of its time. Now,
Absolutely.
This was 1958. And they did that because if the Russians came, they figured that they could black out our radios. And this was a channel that they didn't even know about. And so the guy would show me what he was going to do. My instruments would go to where he was going to go. And then all of a sudden a red light would come on, and my airplane would go wherever he wanted it to go.
Wow, that's the first time I've ever heard of that. That's really cool.
We were way ahead. And they did that in the Northeast with the F-86 because it was an airplane that was able to do things like that.
That's really, really cool.
Yeah, and it was way ahead of its time.
Do they have one of those in a museum anywhere, at the Air Force Museum or anything? Or
the one they have in the museum is not an L model.
Okay.
It's a D model. I've been there, tried to get into it. They welded the steps, so I couldn't get in.
The D models were more common. Is that correct?
No. Well, the D models were the first models, but then they took all the Ds and put them through a program where they lengthened the wing a foot and a half and put all new fancy instruments and a little bit better engine in it. And it could go, well, for instance, the L just was better in all respects than the D. And one day on my bucket list, I have bucket lists when I was in there, bucket list was to see how high you could get the L model. And so that day I did all the things I was supposed to, went an afterburner all the way up to 40,000 feet. Then I went to 42, 44, 46, 48, and at about 50, it was done for. It just couldn't go anymore because what I was in a place where if I slowed down, I stalled, and if I went too fast, I bucked the transonic zone, which we could not go through the sonic barrier unless we were going straight down. And so I finally got up to 52,250 feet. And it took me a while because I'd have to go to max 0.99 Mach, and it wouldn't go any faster than that. And then I'd let it pull up, and it would drift a little bit higher each time. And finally I got it up to 52,250 feet, and it was beautiful up there. I could see the darkness of the sky above the horizon.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Were you ever able to take pictures of that? Or?
Oh, no.
No.
We just didn't do things like that. We should have.
Yeah.
Basically saw the curvature of the earth at that.
That's really cool.
Just a slight curvature, not much, but you can see a little bit. But I love the purple dark above.
Sure.
The bright sunlight of the earth.
So when you first saw that, do you remember what your initial thought was?
I was just amazed. I just took a deep breath and went, wow, this is great in my mind.
And what was the time frame? Like a minute, 30 seconds, 20 seconds? How long did that last?
Oh, I stayed up there for about 5 minutes.
Okay. So you got a good look. You got to experience it.
I just experienced it and just looked and looked and looked.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
The thing that's kind of funny to me, I was going to say Mr. Reynolds, it's so much easier for that to come out of my mouth.
That's all right.
The thing that's kind of funny for me, Mr. Reynolds, is it almost seems like you had a lot of latitude. It's almost like you were a test pilot when really that was your duty.
I think I only have one or two test pilot in my record. We'd go up and be test pilots now and then, but not very often.
How did you acquire this seemingly like
carte blanche almost?
Carte blanche, just take a plane, go do some fun stuff, have a good time.
Well, let me tell you this, and I'm not going to take credit for this, but you've heard of Top Gun, haven't you?
Yeah.
I was Top Gun in my flight. We didn't have Top Gun in those days.
Okay.
But we had number one. Okay. And here's how it started. When you fly an F-86, you go in the simulator and go through all the training in the simulator. And the first time you walk out to the airplane, you're by yourself. There's nobody else in there. You're going to take it off all by yourself. And that's a little bit nervous. And so I noticed that when I got ready to got my airplane, I noticed that my neighbor, who lived next door to me, jumped up on the side of the airplane. And he said, Lieutenant, he said, this is the best airplane on the base. I heard that. It didn't really mean anything to me, okay? Now, he was a nice neighbor. He and I would talk all the time. You know, I knew he had lots of stripes, but I didn't know anything about him. I didn't ask, and he didn't tell. And so I go up, take the mission. Everything was fine. I come back, and my crew chief jumps up on the side and looks at me and says, are you somebody special? I said, I don't think so. He said, do you know who that was? And I said, yeah, he's my neighbor. He said, no, he's the line chief. He was in charge of all the airplanes. Now, here's the story of why I was number one. I wasn't any better than anybody else. However, we would take our names, send them down to maintenance. Maintenance would put a number behind our name and send it back to us. Guess who never had a radar problem? Guess who never had an aircraft problem? I always had this. The most intercept you could get on a mission was 12. I had 14 one night.
Wow.
Because I had a great controller and the airplane was perfect. And I did 14, and he said, well, we can only log 12. And I said, that's okay. But he was just a great guy, great neighbor, and a great line chief.
It sounds like you were in a great position to take advantage of that.
And I didn't understand it for about halfway through. I just they'd say, boy, I had trouble with this and that. I was afraid to say I didn't have any trouble. I was afraid somebody would get mad at me or something. But
how old were you at that time?
Well, I was about 23.
Okay.
And it was, I tell you what, it was just such a glorious thing, especially when you got into the F-86. F-86 was a pilot airplane. It would just do things that we couldn't dogfight, okay? We did, but we were not supposed to because we could only pull about 5 Gs. Now, as I said, the T-33 could pull 9.5, but that we could only pull about 5.5 before we went into a high-speed stall because we were up around the high Mach numbers. And so we didn't do that. I did one other thing that you wanted to say. One night we were getting ready to go, and I was number 3 in a flight of 3. The target was up there ready to go, and we were scrambling off 20-second intervals. And just about the time that number 2 went down the runway, I was number 3. Number 2 went down the runway. I heard Tar say, okay, aircraft, Cessna aircraft so-and-so, you're clear to take off of your runway to the north. I knew what I was going to do right then. I just knew what. And so I knew that was a Cessna from the Aero Club taking off on a runway that was north of our regular runway to keep away. And so sure enough, I took it off, pulled the gear up, pulled it out afterburner, pulled the throttle back to about 250 knots, instead of 600. Till about the 250 knots, I turned, and just as I turned, I spotted the radar. The radar had a beautiful blip. That Cessna put out a blip better than any other one I'd ever seen. And so what I did was I signed it up. I did an intercept. My dot was right in there where it's supposed. And when I went by him, I splashed him, as we used to say. I splashed him, and about that time, the tower controller said, nice shot, number 3. Just so happened my flight commander was number 1. Number 2 was just somebody else. And he said, what's happened back there, number 3, everything? I said, everything's okay, sir. I said, we'll tell you about it when we get back. Well, everything we did was on a recording tape. Behind us, we had something called NADAR, which is a recording tape of everything we did.
Basically a black box kind of thing.
Like a black box. And so when I got home, boy, I pulled that out. We went in there, and it was a beautiful intercept. It was perfect. Well, it was slow. See, we weren't going 600 knots.
Right.
And it was slow, and the dot was right in the center. I shot him down, real quick. And we looked at it about 3 or 4 times.
Now, my question is did the Cessna know what happened to him?
That's what I was going to ask.
Well, now, I don't know whether the Cessna did. The tire controller could have told him we were on different frequencies.
I gotcha.
You know, I couldn't talk to him, and he couldn't talk to me because they were on a military frequency.
Earlier, you had mentioned Russia, and so I think it's important for people to understand kind of what you're describing is almost kind of war games. You're basically practicing as if you're actually in combat and having an actual dogfight. But since you mentioned Russia and you've mentioned the years of service, I think it's important, part of the point of this podcast is education. Help us understand kind of the context of the time in which you were serving and what your mission was.
Great point, Ethan.
They pretty much had us brainwashed. In other words, when we went overseas, and I was in the States, it was all training. Now, we did some intercepts, but over there, we flew armed at all times. I had 24 2.5 rockets under me at all times. We flew armed every mission, and the only thing we did for safety was we pulled the first 3 breakers, circuit breakers, on the firing control system. We pulled those out so you couldn't accidentally shoot somebody, okay? And so we were always, every 4th day, we were on alert, and when we got scrambled, in ourselves, we thought maybe this is the right one.
Sure.
Okay? Now, we knew it wasn't, but we thought that. And one night, it really shook me up because we scrambled, I don't know, about midnight or something. We scrambled out to the northeast, which was the Mediterranean, where the bombers would come from. We normally didn't do that, but we did this time. And the controller, in all his calmness, very simply said, "Breakers in." That meant we pushed the 3 breakers in so that the firing control system could now fire.
You're hot, basically.
We're hot. And as a result, I thought about that for I don't know how many minutes. I thought, this is going to be real. Well, it wasn't. It was an Italian airliner that didn't fly his course right. And so we made a run on him.
He learned real quick that he was in trouble.
Well, see, there were very few regulations, and normally when we'd go out to catch an airliner, we'd be two in a flight, and one would go down and fly formation with the airliner and wave at the passengers, and the other one, of course, would stay up so the radios would work all the time. And as a result, it was pretty nice to, the passengers loved it. Now if you did that, you'd be in prison.
Yeah. Sure. That's a no-go.
Yep.
Hey, Mr. Reynolds, I want to hear one more story, and then I want to talk a bit about your life post-service. We got to hear the Chuck Yeager group story.
That was a good one. We were armed all the time, and normally we had a target that we would fly a mission against, okay? But then other times we would be scheduled to fly with no target, no wingman, just by yourself. And they just wanted you to get time. My bucket list there was when I got one of those missions, I would take off in half burner to save fuel. I would fly up to the Mediterranean and look at the nice blue water. I'd look at the Atlantic Ocean, which was dirty and black, more or less. And I would just have a good time. And so one day I went up to the Mediterranean, and I flew back down to the base, and I started back to the Mediterranean again, and the controller says, "Hey, so-and-so, looks like we got 2 coming out of Spain." Now, that meant to me that we knew Chuck Yeager's squadron was at a place up in Spain called Morón, Spain, and we knew he was there. Our controllers knew that, and the controller said he thinks it might be F-100s. See, he couldn't tell, but he said, they're in formation, and he said, would you like to take a crack at them? And I said, you bet it. And so he lined me up, and he said, first thing I remember him saying, he said, stay at 34,000. He said, you won't be pulling any contrails at 34. They're pulling contrails at about 37. And so
you're going to stay hidden at that altitude.
I'd stay down there. They couldn't see me coming if they even looked out. So I stayed at 34. He lined me up beautifully. My dot was perfect on the radar. I was going to wipe him out, And as a result, the last minute, I pushed the power up, and I climbed the extra couple thousand feet and went right behind him.
Yeah, there you go.
And as I went right behind him, I could tell from the wings, their wings shook real quick, and they started in the tight turn. Well, I knew that I was no match for a 100. And so all I did was pull the throttle back to idle. I got slow enough so the wing slats came out in front, which would allow me to fly very slow. And all I did was turn and keep my nose on the 100s as they made their tight turn to try to get back at me. Okay? They could never get back at me because I was going too slow. About 180 degrees of turn, I knew I was in trouble because number 2 of the 100s broke off and went the other direction. I knew I was in trouble.
They're going to flank you, basically.
I could not handle them then. So there was a cloud layer deck at about 18,000 feet. So I pulled it back, spun down into the cloud layer, and went back to my base in the clouds.
Awesome.
And so I said, you still got them? They said, no, they went down lower, and I can't get them. They're too low for the radar to pick up. And so I thought, those guys are waiting for me as I come out of the clouds at my base. Well, I came out of the clouds, looked around, they weren't there. He didn't know what happened to him either. So I didn't say anything. In those days, you just didn't say anything to the other pilots because you had something that they didn't have.
Sure.
Yep.
You kind of burned them.
Yep.
And so as a result, 2 days later, the commander came into the briefing room. He normally didn't come in to talk to us. But the commander came in, and we thought, something's up. He said, all right, which one of you guys
Who was it?
did it? and I acted like I didn't know what he's talking about. He said, you guys know which one of you spliced 2 of Yeager's boys. And I raised my hand real quick. He said, just to let you know, Yeager will be here in 2 weeks.
Prepare yourself.
2 weeks later, he came down in the beautiful F-100 polished like no other 100 I've ever seen. We were allowed to go in the same room with him across the room, in the big room at the club, and we were not allowed to go up to him at all. We couldn't go to him unless we were called. And so I was standing over there like, when's he going to call me over? I want to shake his hand.
He was essentially royalty in the aviation world.
He was,
for those who don't know,
the best. And I just wanted to shake his hand, And he never did call me over. And finally, he asked them. I could feel his lips. He asked him who it was, and they pointed over to me. And the only thing he did was just move his head a little bit. That was it.
That was the acknowledgement.
He was giving you some acknowledgement there. Yep.
And I was not allowed to go over and talk to him. Never did get to shake his hand or anything.
And what year was that? Do you remember what year that was?
Yeah, it was the end of 1958.
58, okay. Awesome. That's a great story.
Yeah.
So another thing I wanted to get into before we close today, like I said, part of the purpose of the podcast is education and helping people understand our military history. Sure. It's also to highlight the service of those after they are out of the military. And so you have a pretty inspirational story regarding junior ROTC and also just life as an educator post-service. So tell us about that.
Well, I was a vocational teacher by trade, and as a result, I just had a good time at DuPo because you have to understand that in 1934, DuPo built a vocational building. The second building in the triad there was a vocational building with all classes pointed right toward vocational education. I had a great training when I was in high school, and of course I went back and got a job and even got to talk to my instructor at a meeting we had one time. I just loved to talk to him because we had the very best equipment. We did not have school equipment. We had commercial equipment. And so everything was different, better, a little bit heavier than anybody else had. And so as a result, I enjoyed going back to my own school to teach. I was in the reserves a little bit, but I thought, well, I better go back and get a master's degree. So I started doing that. And about 1965, the government became loose with their money and began to give us money that we could do just about what we wanted to do in a class. Like one time I set up a aircraft riveting class, and McDonald hired every student that I'd turn out, sight unseen.
Wow.
Because all I did was take their lessons and put it down at the high school level. So when they went,
they got free training out of you.
Right, exactly. And as a result, when they'd go to work, they knew all about what was going to happen in their training. Well, I was doing my master's at Carbondale. Had a couple of great professors. They were just outstanding. And I was talking to one day, and he said, Reynolds, he said, you're Air Force, aren't you? Yeah, I said, yes. He said, why don't you think about some sort of aviation class when you go back next year? And so I thought, that's a pretty good idea, So I spent some time, and I wrote a proposal and all this and sent it up to the state. And sure enough, boy, within a month, I got a call, and they said, Bill, we want to fund your proposal for aerospace education. And of course, I called it vocational aerospace education. We didn't teach anybody to fly, but we taught them about the Air Force. We taught them about flying, civilian, all the jobs. And the thing that I'm so impressed with now, 30 years after I retired, I'm now seeing those people who are now retiring also that were in my class. And I can't believe the number of them that went into the service or went into civilian aviation of some sort. I had one boy, and I can't mention names, I don't think, with this. My counselor came down the hall one day. Normally when I saw him coming down the hall, I knew that I was going to get a special kid, normally having trouble up with the academics. But he came down, he said, it's not the same, it's not the same. He said, I've got two boys up there. One's got 160 IQ and the other one's got 180. And he said, they're having trouble with academics. The one boy will cry if he gets a B+. Okay? He said, he needs a male teacher. So I put him in my aerospace class. They were both excellent students. One of them, I think you've heard of Admiral Richthofen, the father of the nuclear submarine.
Mm-hmm.
One of my boys was his aide.
Oh, wow.
So, he was pretty good. He had 2 doctor's degrees, things like that. Well, anyway, what happened was we finally got the aerospace class up and funded. The first year, I felt sorry, and I apologized to the class at a reunion. It was probably the worst class I'd ever set up. And so I knew it was not right to do it that way, so I set it up and designed a class just for high school kids.
At their level, per se? Or?
At their level.
Yeah.
Now, if they wanted to and we did have some kids go on to get their license, but they didn't do it in our class. They would go up to Parks Air College or Bevel Area College to get their, and some of them did that. A number of them did that. In fact, your dad.
My dad included, yeah.
His dad was in a program where, since it was research, I could do about anything I wanted. So I had a great program. Most of it's in the book. But what do you do for the kids who are juniors and now are seniors? What do you do with those people? I didn't have the time for that. And so what we did, we sent them up to Parks, and we paid for their license.
Oh, wow.
See, I had the money to pay for it, and we paid for the license, and Sergeant Gross's dad always wanted to know who was the best. There was another student in my class, and they were both just excellent students. His name's Larry Pulcher. I can say that because it's a positive thing. And when Larry came to my house, he'd say, Mr. Reynolds, who was best? And I'd say, Larry, it was you.
There you go.
His dad comes to my house, Mr. Reynolds, who was best? I said, you were.
Yep.
Ever the diplomat.
Absolutely. I was just going to say, that's great politics right there.
and I have no idea how to judge those two. I that's not one of the things I was in my grade book. I didn't know how to judge 2 excellent people,
That's really interesting. These days you don't get those opportunities. Our kids don't get those opportunities to do things like that, I mean, even the simple things like wood shop are gone now on a lot of places.
Yes, they are.
So how were they graded in that class? I mean, was it based on participation or knowledge testing?
It was just everything. We had testing just like a normal student would have, but we had all sorts of things. We had field trips, and we had work study, as we sort of called it. Nowadays they call it shadowing. Mm-hmm. And we had 6 weeks of shadowing where some of our girls went to TWA or Delta Airlines and worked as ground hostesses.
Okay.
In fact, we almost got in trouble one time. We were working with TWA, and these two girls had their own uniforms and everything, so they sort of looked real. and one day, bad weather, flights delayed. They were overcrowded. They didn't have enough people to help them, so they put two of our girls with a group without a TWA person in charge. And these girls understood weather because they'd had the classes, and the girls told all about why we're delayed and all this kind of good stuff. A week later, TWA gets a letter from the home office, wants to credit two of your employees with some sort of an outstanding award because they did such a good job. It just so happens the TWA vice president in New York, his mother was in that group. And when she went back, she told him about these two ground hostesses that just knew all about why things. And we got it back. And, of course, TWA didn't have anybody working in the St. Louis terminal.
Employees.
They weren't employees.
They get invited by the guy up to New York or what?
No. But that's the kind of things that we had fun with. A lot of guys, we sort of got in trouble at Scott Air Force Base. I got a call and said, Bill, our program is working great. Your kids are not allowed to taxi around in the jets. They just get in the jet and go wherever it was going to taxi, and they just thought it was a good deal. I said, we don't think our liability covers that.
Wow.
In fact,
imagine that today.
Yeah. And what happened was, I have to say that our program went from 66 to 77, but in along about 64 or 74, we could hear this word called liability sneaking up on us.
Sure.
They said you have to have insurance. We couldn't afford the insurance.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it just so happened that in 1967, I'd helped Belvidere Area College get their program started because I had it first, so I knew how to do it. And so they heard that I was in trouble, and so they called me up and said, Bill, how about this? Said, we'll make you an instructor, and you can fly your own kids in our airplane, and we'll take the liability off your hands.
Nice.
Wow. So for about 3 or 4 years, we flew for Belvidere Area College, and they took the liability, but it was going to come.
Yeah.
I traded aerospace for another vocational program when I became principal.
Well, the reason I wanted Mr. Reynolds to share that, thank you for doing so, is, you hear about people in society who pay it forward.
Absolutely.
They have those experiences as they're young that build their character, build who they are, and then they get out and they pay it forward and they give the community back what they got. And I think Mr. Reynolds is a perfect, he's the epitome of that kind of person. So
sounds like it, and you're a product of it.
I am, very much so.
Yeah.
He is pretty good.
He is, isn't he?
Yeah, I have a grandson that was his.
That's right, Aaron. Yep.
Aaron was his. I don't know what to call them. They were friends, but they also competed.
Kind of like my dad and Larry almost.
Okay.
Who's better?
And, of course, I was always leaning toward, because Ethan was doing the things that I respected more than going to college and getting a worthless degree.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad he's here with me now.
Yeah. My grandson, just to let you know, he's now been a nurse up in Madison, Wisconsin for a year.
Good.
And he's going back and get his degree, and he loves nursing. So.
And we need a lot of good nurses, too. Yeah. I mean, the healthcare community is struggling for nurses, so that's awesome.
But I didn't get a $10,000 signing bonus.
No, you didn't.
I went to work.
No. They charged you for that fuel you took for the jets.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Your deductions were showing. No fuel cards, though. Well, Ethan, is there anything else you wanted to ask Mr. Reynolds before we end the show? I don't want to end it early, but
no, sure. I'm glad you said that. I think something that's on my mind, Mr. Reynolds, is As you look back, I mean, you're no spring chicken. I hope that's not offensive to you, but you've lived a long time.
91 and a half.
91 and a half. As you look back at your whole life, how do you sum it up, if that's even possible?
Well, I'll tell you what, I had a difficult time. I feel sorry for these people now that come back from combat, because I knew I didn't have PTSD or anything like that, but I understand the transition. From here you are with a $1 million airplane doing something that could get you in trouble at all times, and then you come back to a school system where the teachers are worrying about whether the kid had a pencil or not. I had a difficult time. I quit eating lunch with them. I couldn't take it, because the first thing I did when they had the pencil problem was I got about a dozen pencils, sharpened them, and laid them on my desk and said, anybody needs a pencil, there they are. I didn't think that was any type of a discipline problem. I thought it was silly. But I did have some, I had a couple of, if you have time, I have a couple of stories that you might want to listen to, because in one of them I probably shouldn't be here.
Well, let's talk about it. We got time.
Sure, yeah.
The first one was when I was in fighter school, I was the only one that had a flame out. I was at 40,000 feet, and all of a sudden the engine flamed out. No big deal. I'd been through this in the simulator. I knew exactly what to do. And I glided down to 30, which you had to get at that level before you could restart the engine. The engine started up, and I thought, wow, just like in the simulator. Okay.
Practice makes perfect.
Came back, landed, and of course, everybody was watching, because I had the engine running, but we weren't allowed to use the emergency fuel control because it would overheat the engine and things like that. So I landed without power and just pulled up. Everything was fine. Instructors shook my hand, and said, be ready to go. You have to fly again this afternoon. That's, I guess, get back on the horse after you've been bucked off.
Yeah, that makes sense, yep.
So I went back. So I was the only one. I was popular for about 10 minutes. And then it went on, because things were just, you expected things to happen. And so then I went into squadron, and everything was going real well. And one day they said, they had a briefing, they said, okay, at 10:30, stay away from the southern area, because we have a Russian Tu-104 that's going to Casablanca. We want you to stay away from that area. At 10 o'clock, the phone rang. I wasn't scheduled to fly that day. 10 o'clock, the phone rang. They said, hey, we got one to test. New one from Germany came in. We need a test flight on it. I said, I got somebody. Hung up the phone, ran out there with my parachute, got in, took off, went to the south part of where that 104 had my radar on. I was scanning the sky. I scanned it for about 30 minutes. He didn't show. So I was decided, well, if he's not going to show, I'm going to have to get something out of this. So I decided to play Blue Angel and Thunderbird. And I was putting the airplane through all sorts of maneuvers just like they did. And all of a sudden, in one maneuver, I noticed we had two little lights on the dashboard. One was yellow, one was red. Red meant bail out. If the red one came on, that meant your fuel was in trouble. It was burning or something. And so you're supposed to bail out. The yellow one said, get ready. And so I was up there, and all of a sudden I was maneuvering around, and the sun must have got in behind me, and the red light flashed. And I thought, oh, wow. I leveled out real quick, looked at the red light again. It sort of went out. And I said, well, it must have been the sun. So I went back and did it again. I did this 3 times, and the last time the red light came on, steady, bright red. Okay? Well, I looked in the rearview mirror. I couldn't see any trailing smoke, so I just shut the airplane off real quick. And so it glided just like an airplane should glide. It was beautiful. I was only about 20 miles from the base, so I just glided back and landed, and I hated fire trucks to follow me down the runway, so I would pull up in front of the fire trucks,
Cut their commute a little bit.
Yes, exactly.
And so I pulled up in front of the fire trucks, and here comes a fireman and the line chief. They're walking toward the airplane, and they get about 10 yards from it, and they go, they use their hands to motion that I should get out of the airplane. So I got out of the airplane, and you could hear the fuel boiling in the tanks.
Oh.
Because what happened was our fuel tanks were wrapped around the bottom of the engine. And the bottom of the engine, the casting broke. They'd never seen one like that. The casting broke and allowed the hot air to go into the fuel tank area. And the hot air was like about, 715 degrees centigrade.
Wow.
And it was pretty hot. And so as a result, just lucky I shut the engine off as quick as I did, because
Which allowed it to cool at least
Good
somewhat.
instincts there. Good instincts, yeah.
yeah, well, I just felt like that was the right thing to do. Well, went there and they stayed away from the airplane for a while it was boiling in the tanks. And what they had to do was, of course, they had to change the engine. They'd never seen an engine break like that before. And they also had to change the fuel tanks, because I think we had 14 layers of rubber and whatever to make a fuel tank, 14 layers, and it burned through about half of them.
Wow.
And so it was okay because I still had the other half. But if it had gone through the other layer, then the whole inside back part of the engine would become a flaming mess.
Yeah.
How long were you
Fireball.
up there before you realized there was a problem? Do you remember how long that was?
Oh, yeah, I was this way about 30 minutes, so it was about 45 minutes.
And so within that 45 minutes, something went wrong, and that's when it started.
Within the last 5 minutes
Oh, wow.
of
Okay.
or 45, just the last minute when I was putting the airplane through all sorts of things.
Sure.
And so I got back, and the safety officer came to me and he said, "You didn't follow directions, did you?" I said, "Sir, I brought the airplane back. Was all right." He said, "But that's not what the book says." "What does the book say?" I said, "Bail out." I said, "But I didn't feel like I needed to. I didn't see any smoke. The instruments did not do anything. I didn't have fuel indications of any kind." I said, "Things were good. I brought the airplane back." He said, "I'm sorry. You're going to go before a flying evaluation board." Well, when the commander heard about it, he squashed it. He said, "You can't do that to him. He brought an airplane back, So everything was fine. And the squash was just, we didn't even publicize it or anything. Everybody just kept quiet.
Yeah, you saved the Air Force a lot of money.
I can't imagine that you and safety officers saw eye to eye very often.
And the last one was, they had, I guess, from World War II, but we got grounded 2 weeks before we were forced to come back to the States. And pilot with nothing to do for 2 weeks was miserable. So I had my helmet with me. I had a motor scooter and a bag on the back, and I put my parachute in the back, put my helmet in the back. I'd go down to the where we scrambled the airplanes, the alert hangar, and I'd say, "You guys need, any time, I'll be happy to take your place for a bit." Well, they didn't want me. They wouldn't do that. So one day I went down there, and one of the guys who were the older guys said, "Yeah, Bill, I forgot to get my wife a present. It's our anniversary, and I forgot all about it." He said, take my slot for about an hour or so." And so I said, "Yeah, I'll do that." So I set up for about an hour. I set it up, and about he'd gone about 15 minutes, and the first alert horn went off. Well, I was on the second, so I didn't go the first time. In fact, the first two scrambled off, and as the first two went, we'd always go out and sit in the cockpit in case you got another one.
Yeah.
Just be ready. So I was sitting in the cockpit with nothing to do, talking to the crew chief, and about that time, the second horn went off. Okay? So I even looked at him. I said, "Go in and see if that's real." And I'm getting ready to go while he's going in. He comes running out, and said, "Go, go, go." And so I took off, and it just so happened that my wingman, or I was his wingman that day, he was a guy who needed some money. He said, he had more service time. He was going to stay in. And he tried to bring his wife over, and he said, "I'm $200 short." I just went I gave him $200. And so he was I was his wingman that day, or he was mine. And so he paid me back everything. And we went up, and we were directed to Northwest, which we never were. Northwest would be toward the east coast of the African
That theater.
Yeah,
Yep.
that theater. And sure enough, we got about, we were out about 50 miles, and all of a sudden, here's an Italian airliner. And Armin was his name. He went down, and the passengers waved at him and all this kind of good stuff. And I stayed up for the safety. And so he said, I said, Armin, we got ready to get back. We're getting low on fuel. So we broke off the airliner. And what we do is we check our instruments anytime we change a position. And so I was checking my instruments. My eyes flickered down to the oil pressure. And I'd never seen the oil pressure do anything but be right in the green. And my oil pressure was flickering a little bit, and the next thing I know, it was heading toward the red line. And finally, it hit the red line, and the airplane began to shake. And so very quickly, I shut it off again and it shook so much I could not visually see the cockpit. It was shaking so bad. And finally, after I shut it off, it came to a stop. Well, I knew what had happened. I bet the engine was not whirling in the area, and that I wasn't going to be able to fly the airplane because our controls were hydraulic.
Yeah.
And unless we had the engine turning to move the hydraulic pump, you couldn't
Steer
the airplane.
Yep.
So no big deal. I set it up, and I was using electric trim to guide the airplane, and we started heading back for the base, 50 miles out. Armin said, and he was on the radio. I'd shut everything down, so I was saving electricity. And he taps his helmet, and he said, Bill, looks like you're going to have to bail out about 5 miles from the base. He said, we got a headwind at this altitude, and he said, we're not going to be able to make it. So, boy, that shook me up. I was tightening up my straps and all that kind of good stuff. We glided for another 10 minutes or so. He taps again. He said, Bill, you won't believe this, but we've got a tailwind now. You know, we were up high, and probably we were at 30,000, and probably when we got to 30 to 20, it was going one direction.
The pressure changed.
10 to, it changed.
Yeah.
And he said, looks like you're going to be able to make it. Well, that really made me feel good. And I could see the airport up there, so many miles away. And so I came over the top. I was going to be able to shoot a regular flame-out pattern. Everything was going to be fine. I clicked over to tire frequency, and tire said, we got Sirocco winds, don't you? And I said, yes. He said, no one has made a flame-out pattern all day, all morning. Said the winds are just messed up. Well, that's no problem. I'm just going to keep it in tight. Instead of landing at the end of the runway, I'm going to land down to third down like the book says. So I kept it in very tight. Now, what happened when I came over the top of the air to have guidance, we had a battery that supposedly was good for 10 minutes. So I turned the battery on, and I turned the pump on. We had an emergency hydraulic pump that would let you fly the airplane. So I turned the pump on. I heard it whizzing. I came down to what we called a key point. And I was in good shape. I kept it in real tight, and I could feel that wind really blowing hard. It was pushing me,
Was it crosswinds at that point, or was it?
No, it was a tailwind
Okay.
at that point, and I was going to have to turn into a headwind. So I kept it in tight, and I turned on to final, and I thought, oh boy, I thought I was in closer than this. I'm just going to make it, okay? And so I came down, and I was going to make the edge of the runway, which is no problem. I got about maybe 5 feet above the edge of the runway, and I heard the battery plink, and the fuel pump went off, or the hydraulic pump went off. Well, I didn't need it anymore because I was only 5 feet. I just landed the airplane. Again, guess where I pulled? Up in front of the fire trucks because I didn't want them to follow me down. Line chief comes up, said, thanks for bringing it back, sir, And he said, you want to get out? I said, sure. I tried to get out. I could not move. Evidently, I was afraid coming back. My legs had stiffened up. I could not move my legs.
Oh, wow.
He saw my expression on my face and said, sir, why don't you just stay in the airplane? We'll pull you in. You
Trying
can get
to
out.
save your dignity.
Yeah.
That was nice of him.
Yeah, he did. So we pulled it in, and by that time, I had a difficult time getting out.
I believe it.
But I was okay. Everything was fine. The commander met me, and I got a free dinner that night. What I didn't know was if he'd lost one more airplane, they'd have fired him. See, when you lose an airplane, it's not the pilot. It's the commander that gets a spot on his record.
Those are his aircraft.
Yeah.
He'd already lost two.
Wow.
We lost one guy with an F-86 that had to bail out, and we had a guy in a T-33 that lost his fuel control. He had to bail out. That's two. Okay? And number three would have been, pow.
Yeah.
He'd been gone.
Well, luckily, you were in the pilot's seat for that bird.
Hopefully it was a good dinner. Do you remember what it was?
Steak.
Absolutely. That's what I was hoping for.
It's funny. That's the last thing I'll say. Earlier we had talked about it's all mental. I think that's a perfect story of your body literally had shut down, but your brain was not allowing you to realize it until you completed your mission.
Did not know it until I tried to get up.
And then earlier, I wanted to kind of capstone this. You had talked about a trivial thing like pencils, a school worrying about pencils of all things. And, the stories you've told us, Mr. Reynolds, kind of mind-boggling. And, we were talking earlier about your wife saved your life. You got out a little bit early and that sort of thing. You had a lot of luck in your service, a lot of points in which something had just changed just a little bit. You wouldn't be here today.
I'm old enough now that I don't call it luck anymore.
That's true. Yeah.
Somebody knows more about jet engines than I do.
But I think all that service and all those near misses, so to speak, have given you this understanding that there's bigger things in life. I'll go out and buy some pencils. I'll go out and take care of the students. It's no skin off my nose.
I have to tell you one more story. I don't know whether it's applicable. You can cut it out maybe if you want. I was in my last year of teaching aerospace. See, I knew I was going to be principal the next year, and so I was in my last time. And I didn't keep track of my record. I didn't know this. Anyway, one of the boys in the class came time for a first quarter test. He failed it. I couldn't stand it. I called him in. I said, "You failed this test." And he smiled at me. And he said, "Mr. Reynolds, do you know your record?" I said, "What do you mean, record?" He said, "Do you know that no one has failed to graduate from your vocational classes in the last 10 years or whatever it's been?" I said, "No, I didn't know that." He said, "I've done the research." And he said, "No one has ever failed to graduate from your vocational classes." He said, "Guess what? I'm going to be the first." And I said, "You got to be kidding. You do that?" "Yes, sir." So I worked with him and did all this kind of stuff, and he made sure that he failed every test, And I almost thought at one time in my mind, I thought, I think I'll just cheat and pass it. But I couldn't do that.
Yeah.
I couldn't do that to the other students. And so he was so happy, he shook my hand.
Wow.
At the end.
He was trying to prove a point.
He became famous, and I didn't even know about it.
Yep. Well, I'm really impressed with your story, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the books and how people can get their hands on them. Ethan, you've got two books over there, but I've only got one in front of me, and the one that I have is Tiger 24, and a brief synopsis about what's in the book, and then how can someone get a hold of it.
Okay. I tell you what, why don't I give you one of my cards? Now, you can buy it from Amazon.
Okay.
It costs you about $40. If you contact me, I'll give you one for $20.
Okay.
There we go. What a deal.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can get this particular book on Amazon.
Yes.
But if they want a signed copy from you for $20, they can get it from you.
That's right. They sure can.
Okay.
The thing about it is I didn't realize that was so expensive. And by the time you did shipping in there and all that kind of good stuff,
Sure. Yeah.
it's $40, and it's not worth $40. I give them away if I can.
And Ethan, what's the other book you have? And then we'll get a little description of that.
The other book here is Inspirational Stories for You. So it's a compilation, if I understand correctly, Mr. Reynolds. You have, I think, one or two of your own personal stories.
Yeah, I wrote 2 stories for that. But what happened was I was a Mac computer person. The kids came to me in about 1979 and said, "Mr. Reynolds, you got to get going here. There's something called a computer out, and we don't have it in the school." So they got me to put in, and we bought 2 Apple Plus computers, expensive things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we just thought they were the greatest things going, all right? And so as a result, I was a Mac man my whole life, and so I retired and everything, and I went to work for a school south of us, and I was called the wellness coordinator, and I went into the storeroom and found out that they were getting rid of all their Apples and Macs, but I found enough to put one together, and so I had a Mac on my desk, okay? And my computer was better than their whole system because they'd come and say, would you do this for us? Because I could get online with the Mac and do things that they had trouble with their PCs. And so what happened was very simple. I had that Mac, and people knew about it, and they would send me stories. And so all I do is take a story, read it, put it in a folder. And so probably about 2 or 3 years later, I probably had 30 or 40 stories in this folder. And ever so often, something would happen in the school. There was a story for that, so I'd print it off and hand it to somebody. Here's a story like this. Like a mother, this is a little bit serious, but a mother had a child that really had immune problems, okay? And they thought he was going to die, and then he was going to make it. And then all of a sudden he got, and the reason I know about him, because I found out that my platelets work very well in his body, so I donated platelets for him. Well, he got pneumonia and passed away, okay? And so there's a story in this book about a mother who loses a child. So the first thing I did was change a couple words, and I gave it to her. And she really liked that. And so I had all these stories, and somebody said, Bill, you got all these stories. Why don't you make a book out of it? So after I wrote this one with the help of my brother, because I wrote the book and I gave him credit, he was terminal when I wrote the final copies. Mm-hmm. He was going to die, and he knew it. He said, first thing we're going to do is write that book. So I did for him, basically. So then after that, I made a little bit of money on this, and so I thought, well, why don't I try this of stories? So I did. I put the stories together. Amazon prints these free of charge, by the way.
Oh, really?
It doesn't cost you anything to get these books. Now, you have to jump a couple hurdles. You have to have a professional proofreader, and it just so happened I had one in my office. And so she said, well, I'll do it for nothing. I said, no, you can't do that. They said $100, so you either take $100 or you can't do it. She said, well, I will if that's the way it is. So she proofread these. She's still alive. I still contact her once in a while. And so all we did was do this one. This has always been free, but I didn't have enough copies. Okay.
Well, tell us a little bit. What give us a synopsis of what Tiger 24 is, okay. So the person that's listening that can't see it knows what they're getting into.
Okay, Tiger 24 was my first call sign. Okay, when I went to Spence Air Base, I was in Tiger Flight, and with the name of Reynolds, I was number 24 out of 30. Okay, and so you used your call sign when you got in the airplane. This is Tiger 24. They knew exactly who it was. They knew exactly where you were going and took care of you that way. So I always picked up Tiger 24. Now, as I went into the school system and started the aviation program, I still had some friends at Scott Air Force Base. Okay, so I called them up and I said, as one of my programs, I'd like to run an approach at Scott to show them what it's like to do an instrument approach. They said, no problem. They said, what are we going to call you? I said, Tiger 24. And so what I would do, especially, we sometimes use a Cessna 172, but that isn't really fast enough to stay with Scott's program. And so we used a 182, which I could keep it up over 150 miles per hour. And that's Scott's, and so I'd call in, this is Tiger 24, we'd like to have an approach to Scott. And they had no idea who I was, see. And they'd treat me like an Air Force pilot. And only the guys in charge knew that I was just a plain old civilian guy. And, of course, a lot of times I'd say, we do one, and we had a little time left. I said, I'd make a low approach at Scott, and I said, hey, Scott, we'd like to have an emergency low fuel approach. See, that's a different approach that you make, and only certain controllers can do that approach. But they used to have a good time with me because I'd say a low fuel approach. That was something that you made not like a normal approach. You'd make it like you were going to run out of fuel at any time.
An emergency.
Yeah.
Like emergency.
Was it a coincidence that Dupo's mascot of the Tigers?
I know that. I knew that. In fact, when I had the aerospace program, your dad had a flimsy old cheap jacket, and we had a beautiful emblem that somebody made for
like a Letterman's jacket kind of thing.
Yeah. And we were Tiger Flight.
Nice. Okay. I love it. So if you guys out there that are listening to the podcast, if you want to pick up this book, Tiger 24 by William Reynolds, and then the other book, Ethan.
Inspirational Stories for You.
Okay, Inspirational Stories for You. All right, you guys can pick those up on Amazon. Okay, or if you get a hold of Mr. Reynolds and you want a signed copy, it's going to cost you $20, but you'll save a couple bucks there, plus the shipping.
and if you'd like, Mr. Reynolds, we can, with your permission, we can put your contact information on the website.
Sure.
Well, I mean, this has been really enjoyable for me. I learned way more than I anticipated. And Ethan, thank you so much for bringing Mr. Reynolds to the podcast. And, one thing I'd like to say, I'm glad you kind of led this since you know Mr. Reynolds pretty well, but these stories are, like we said earlier, we have to preserve these and all the wonderful things you did. But Ethan did mention something that I'm really excited to repeat here, is that what you did in the Air Force is awesome, but what you did outside of the Air Force, you shaped and molded these people that have done great things in our community, and one of them being Ethan's dad. So the impact you've made has been great, and we thank you for your military service and for your public service as a school teacher and principal. Ethan, do you have anything you want to say to Mr. Reynolds?
It's been a great pleasure. It's always good to see you, and hope to see a lot more of you soon.
Ethan's almost been like a second son. The best story I have is when Ethan graduated from high school, he became a salesman of utensils.
Cutco, that's right.
And he sold my wife a fork, a professional fork that would probably go through any steel wall that you've ever seen. And my wife, who was somewhat anxious when I was not around and she was there by herself, would take her fork to bed with her as a protective device.
That's the first time I've heard that story. That's hilarious.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, no pun intended, but Ethan is sharp.
Agreed.
Put a fork in it.
Agreed.
Well, it's been our pleasure, and just to remind everybody, this is Captain Bill Reynolds, and we are so happy that we had you on the podcast. We're going to go ahead and sign off of the Operation Insight podcast from the Mid-America Veterans Museum. Have a great night, folks. Operation Insight is brought to you by the Mid-America Veterans Museum. The museum is a 501c3 nonprofit business. Do you like our podcast? With your support, we'll continue to bring you great programming. If you'd like to donate, go to mavm.org and click on Donate.